Fear was in the air in New York City in the 1980s. The city was known as a dangerous and seedy place. A bad economy had pushed people into crime, and the city was on the brink of bankruptcy. And in 1975, in response to budget cuts, a group of New York City police officers distributed a pamphlet that said, "Welcome to Fear City," recommending that tourists stay away, and if they did come to New York, they should stay inside after 6 and avoid using public transit. So in December 1984, when a man named Bernard Goetz shot and nearly killed 4 black teenagers while he was riding the subway, his actions divided the city. Some saw him as a vigilante, born out of a city gone bad. Others saw Goetz as a racist who used crime as an excuse. This is where Leon Neyfakh enters the story, host of a new podcast called Fiasco, Vigilante. Leon, welcome to Crime Story.
Thank you so much for having me.
So take me back to the 1980s. You're a New Yorker. Tell me what New York was like at the time.
I am a New Yorker now, though I arrived long after these bad old days, as they're often referred to. So I didn't see it firsthand. But I think anyone who absorbed the stream of films that take place in New York and portray it as this shadowy and dangerous place where evil lurks around every corner. And, there were a bunch of influential films that kind of characterized New York that way. Taxi Driver, maybe chief among them.
Listen, you fuckers, you screwheads. Here is a man who would not take it anymore. A man who stood up against the scum, the cunts, the dogs, the filth, the shit. Here is someone who stood up.
And basically, one of our tasks in making the show is to kind of go back and try to understand, well, what was the reality?
That was actually going to be my next question.
Yeah, unmistakably, this is the image of New York in the 80s, but what was it really like? And so a lot of people said that, while they themselves weren't always afraid, they were of the mind that everybody else was. And so there was this general sense that, New York was a dangerous place. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew that something could happen on the subway at any second, even if it didn't necessarily happen to you. There were plenty of people who had personal stories of getting mugged, of course, but it was more like you heard about people getting mugged and you were aware that it was a random occurrence that could befall you at any moment. So I think that's where a lot of the fear came from. And people really kind of at a certain point got fed up with it, and they felt like the city had turned their backs on protecting the citizens.
Yeah, and so was there sort of this underlying unsaid idea that crime was mostly perpetrated by black men?
I don't know exactly how to answer that empirically, but certainly the images of criminality that you would see in the pages of, the New York Post and the Daily News would reinforce the sense that, yes, there were these young, dangerous black men who would, take the train in from their bad neighborhoods, and they would terrorize people downtown. And there are these criminal elements who don't follow the rules and who come from outside and make the city unlivable. And yes, there's, unmistakably a racial cast to that.
Okay, so that's the context. That's sort of what's happening in the city. That's the conversations that people are having when Bernard gets on the subway. It's December 22nd, 1984. He's heading downtown. What happens?
So Bernie gets on the train, and at a certain point, he sees a group of young black men approach him, and one of the 4 either asks him for money or demands money. And it's unfortunately impossible to say for sure what was said. Witness testimony later was vague on this. But in Goetz's mind, and this, as we'll discuss, turns out to be the most important thing, in Goetz's mind, these guys were getting ready to rob him and hurt him. And so in a split second, Goetz takes a gun out of his pocket and gets up and opens fire. And he hits all 4 of these young men, Daryl Cabey, James Ramseur, Troy Canty, and Barry Allen, who were all from the South Bronx. None of them die by some miracle, even though he shot them at very close range, but they are grievously injured. In this chaos, Goetz gets off the train, jumps down into the tunnel, and disappears.
So the police are looking for him, but the press also is really involved because this has become a huge story.
Good evening. It is Christmas Eve in New York, and the talk of the town is not peace on earth, but the violence among us, this time in the subways, where a vigilante and his gun brought terror this past weekend. The victims were...
Yeah, well, so the newspapers loved this story. I mean, it was an incredibly dramatic incident. There weren't shootings like this very often. This was before the age of mass shootings happening and no one even noticing anymore. A gunman opening fire in Manhattan was a big, big news story. And the fact that the person at the center of it was nowhere to be found just created this air of mystery around him. And as, witness testimony came in from people who were on the train, and the reporters who were covering the story were, getting information from the NYPD, there emerged this version of events, in which these four thugs, as they were often referred to in the press, had threatened this man who was minding his own business. In fact, that they had threatened him with sharpened screwdrivers, that they had screwdrivers in their pockets that they had brandished in an effort to scare him. And, from this version of events, the person responsible turns into someone just defending themselves.
In one sense, it makes no difference who the vigilante is. What really is significant is that thousands of New Yorkers are so fed up with punks and crime that they think the shootings are great.
He was right.
He was right.
He was right.
To do the shooting.
Yeah.
And against the backdrop of all of that fear and anger at the city government for not doing more to rein in violent crime, whoever this guy was looked like a hero. And so in the New York Post, to a slightly lesser extent in the Daily News, two rival tabloids who were sort of in the middle of a great circulation war, this mysterious gunman kind of emerged as like a mythic avenger, someone people celebrated. And one thing that happened is that the police set up a tip line. If you know who did this, if you know where he is, call us and leave us a message. And instead what happened is all these people who had been following the story on the news called in talking about how happy they were that this guy had stood up for himself and how proud they were and how, it's only too bad that he didn't, do anything worse to them.
But on the other side, one of the victims, Daryl Caby, who was really the worst one hurt, his mother didn't get any support at all.
Yeah, I mean, the papers did do stories on the victims. It's not like they totally ignored them. But for the most part, they were described as a group. They were this crew. People called them a gang. They didn't really differentiate between them. They talked about their criminal records and the problems they'd had with the law. And Daryl Caby, who, as you said, was sort of most seriously injured, he was actually paralyzed in the end and suffered issues with his brain. He was in the hospital, and no one knew if he was going to survive, and no one was really very worried about it, in the public sphere. And so Caby's mom, she was kind of on her own, and the whole family was sort of on their own. And I didn't get the sense that they were tracking the media coverage super closely during this time because they were primarily worried about, Daryl surviving. But eventually, they started getting hate mail and horrible phone calls and, people writing to Daryl's mother and telling her that they wished her son had been killed. I mean, it was really like an early kind of doxing situation where all of this ambient anger and hatred landed on this poor woman's doorstep.
So you have locals engaged and animated, but you also have huge political figures weighing in. President Reagan even commented on it.
That's right. I mean, Reagan was asked about it in a press conference. And, Reagan, I guess to his credit, maybe was pretty firm in saying that, we can't have people taking the law into their own hands. That's not a society. It would lead to a breakdown of civilization. But he also made a point of saying that it's okay to feel understanding or sympathy for someone, as he put it, who was tested beyond his ability to control himself. And so he kind of tried to have it both ways. But yeah, I mean, it was a massive story. There are people covering it from all over the world.
Eventually Goetz is caught. How does he get caught?
He turns himself in. He walks into a police station in New Hampshire, and I think he says something along the lines of, "I'm the subway gunman." And so they take him into custody. They call the NYPD, who immediately send people up to New Hampshire to talk to Goetz. And what happens from there is Goetz just spills his guts for hours and hours and hours in a recorded interview in which he kind of gave his version of events and gave a lot of insight into his state of mind. And, this videotape eventually became very important in the case.
Does Goetz himself see himself as a vigilante? Like, I know he admits to being the subway shooter, but does he actually believe and say that he's taking things into his own hands?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he stops short of saying, like, he deserves to be honored.
I'm no hero. Basically, I'm a coward.
He kind of, like, says these quasi-self-deprecating things about how he, anyone would have done what he did in his situation. It was pure instinct. It was, nothing right or wrong about it. It was just what happened. He comes across as paranoid, for one thing, but also kind of nihilistic.
What if someone else in that subway system were butchered? And the guys, you think the guys would have been caught? You think it would have been any big thing? It would have been one more statistic, and don't nod your head yes, because you know better.
Extremely angry.
If you don't know better, you just don't know New York.
Extremely hostile to the city of New York, like really sounds like he hates New York. And at one point kind of recoils at one of the New York officers asking him a question. He's just like, I don't even want to talk to you. Like he has such a distaste for New York. And one of the questions I've always had about his life story is like, why did he stay here for so long? And what we found out later was he was always kind of a loner and a shy child. Had a lot of problems with bullying growing up in Rhinebeck, New York, upstate. As an adult, was primarily interested in electronics. He, for his job, he was someone who tested testing equipment, which I thought was quite funny. But basically, like he had begun his career as an engineer at Westinghouse, where he was, helping build nuclear submarines for the Navy. But then he was let go because of arguments with other people, just kind of a motif in his life. He was always like itching for a conflict is my read on it. He
pretty antisocial guy.
Yeah, and a pretty antisocial guy. Had made racist remarks at a community meeting. He was really only friendly, to the extent that he was friendly, with these guys who hung out at an electronics shop that he liked to buy stuff at, and they would go to like ham radio festivals together. But even with those guys, he was very much a cipher. I mean, I think they saw him as like someone who didn't really let anyone close.
Right. And what about his relationship with crime? Did you even find out why he was carrying a gun?
Yes. I mean, this was like a very important part of the story. Not long before this incident on the 2 train, Goetz was the target of an attack also on the subway. We talked to a guy who worked at the electronics shop, the one where Goetz would always go. And he told us the story about, being there, minding the store, and then suddenly Bernie runs up and kind of slams against the front door, the window. It becomes clear that someone is chasing him. And so the backstory turned out to be that Goetz had been on the subway, had, been threatened by a group of guys, black guys who, wanted his money or whatever. And he took off and he started running back to the store, which was like his, home base. And from there, the attacker fled, but I think ultimately was caught, and Goetz was quite badly hurt, but also, I think that actually this was more important, was extremely offended that the guy who had attacked him basically was allowed to walk. And I think in Goetz's telling, like, had spent even less time at the police station than Goetz did, answering questions. And so I think this incident imprinted itself on Goetz. I mean, he had already had a lot of the fear, I think, that this incident hardened, but it was after this incident that he decided to buy a gun. And he bought a gun down in Florida, and he brought it back to New York illegally. And basically, I think this was his way of saying, like, never again. I'm never going to let that happen again.
And it was that illegal gun that he used to shoot the 4 boys.
He actually bought a bunch of guns, is my understanding. He bought guns for other people and sold them to friends, I guess, at cost because he just believed
in the cause.
Exactly, yeah. And so I don't know if it was that exact gun, but yes, he had an illegal gun on him when these 4 young men approached him on the 2 train.
So you'd think that with his confession tape, and the illegal gun, that criminal charges would be a slam dunk.
Yeah, well, I mean, so we didn't even really mention this, but in the confession, in the interview, the reason you call it a confession is that in this long interview he did in New Hampshire, I mean, he talked completely candidly about how He wanted to kill these guys. He, could tell from the way they were looking at him that they wanted to play with him and play around with him and torture him. And he said he fantasized about clawing their eyes out, and doing much worse to them than he did.
Look, if I had more bullets, I would have shot them all again and again. My problem was I ran out of bullets, and I was gonna gouge one of the guy's eyes out with my keys afterwards.
The most important thing that he said in this interview was that, at one point, after opening fire, he saw one of the four, Daryl Cabey, on the ground, and he seemingly was okay. And in his own telling, Goetz said to him, "You don't look so bad. How about another?" or something along those lines. And then he shot him again.
I went to him the second time, and I looked at him. And he can't verify this because he was probably out of it by then. If I had shot him or if he wasn't, I don't know. And I said, "You seem to be doing all right. Here's another."
And so that's just like, whatever you want to say about self-defense, that is not how self-defense usually looks.
Yeah.
So after he's arrested, after he gives this insane confession, everyone's assuming he's going to get indicted, but he doesn't. The grand jury does not indict him. It was like a total shock, and it provoked, outrage among certain people in New York City because, we were talking earlier about how everyone was scared of crime and everyone hated, these black thugs coming in from the Bronx, and everyone was happy for Bernie Goetz. Of course, everyone wasn't. I mean, we're talking about a subset of the city and a whole other subset of the city, like people who knew these young men, people who lived in their community, people who understood their community. They saw this as a mortal outrage. And I think the other thing to say there is that, like, it's very rare for a prosecutor to bring charges and not get an indictment. Like the cliche is that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich, right? And so there's questions after this non-indictment came down, like, did the prosecutor's office really try? That was at least my question. And regardless, it became kind of a moot point, in part because of the release of that videotape from New Hampshire. The DA, Robert Morgenthau, does, convene a second grand jury, and the second grand jury does indict Goetz. And that case goes to trial.
Right, because the confession tape eventually gets leaked, and that changes popular opinion, right? At least some people who had been supporting him changed their minds.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that he was so bloodthirsty in his comments and so clearly unstable made it harder for people to identify with him. Like, he was just kind of a weird guy. I mean, put aside like his antisocial tendencies. I mean, he's a tough guy to identify with. And I think it was a lot easier for people to identify with him and put him on a pedestal before they knew who he was. And so, yeah, like the videotape does get leaked. It gets, quotes from it get leaked initially. And then eventually it's shown in at trial. But Goetz suddenly looks a little bit less reasonable, right? He looks kind of like a maniac. And I think that does hurt his support. But, I got to say, like, overwhelmingly, the mood was still that this was a guy who had simply done what he had to do to protect himself in an impossible situation. Like, a lot of people believed that. I should say, including a lot of black people. Like, the network news at the time definitely made a point of showing that the people who said that Goetz, did what he had to do included a lot of white people, but it also included a lot of black people. And so it wasn't quite so clear-cut in terms of race. But nevertheless, like, the fact that Goetz was white and he gunned down these four young men, there's no way for racism to not be at the center of that story.
How was that handled in the trial, though?
It wasn't, or rather, it wasn't by the prosecutors, because they weren't really allowed, because of how the judge ruled, to bring race into the proceedings. However, Goetz's defense lawyers, which included the superstar Barry Slotnick, they took quite clear but sort of subtle steps to remind the jury that these were four scary black guys. They put up posters of the four of them, and they were sort of like blown up so that they looked huge and scary. At one point, one of the defense attorneys was questioning James Ramseur, one of the four young men who was on that train, and Ramseur had been accused and I think convicted of horrible rape, and the prosecutor really went at him on that and got him angry to the point where, in some descriptions of the courtroom that day, Ramseur kind of like lunged, and for a moment it seemed like, the judge was going to lose control of the courtroom. And, I don't actually know exactly what happened. We don't have any video footage of it. But, we talked to a number of the jurors, and one of them, this really stuck with me. She told me that after that incident, she had a dream where she was being threatened by this guy. And so you could say that none of these maneuvers were explicitly racist, but I think they definitely played on, the kinds of race-based fears that they assumed at least some people on the jury would have.
And what about those confession tapes? I was pretty surprised by how the defense handled those. They were pretty smart.
Yeah, the confession tape, you would think, would be the last thing the defense attorneys would want on the record because, as we discussed, Goetz came across as really unrepentant, like not at all someone who is describing an act of self-defense. It seemed like a clear liability for them. But they kind of decided that it would be a way to, in a relatively risk-free way, give Goetz a voice in the trial. They didn't want him to testify. They knew he was too erratic and too easy to provoke to put him on the stand. But they were able to take this video and, spin it as like a portrait of a man who's been driven to like his wit's end by fear, by the threat of bodily harm. Like they rested a lot of their case on the fact that Goetz had this very reasonable fear of being attacked in exactly this way because of the earlier incident. And so, he talks about that incident in this tape. And I think the defense ultimately made the decision that they could show the jury this tape and actually make them see themselves in Goetz and like see him as a human being and see him as a frail, scared guy who, was maybe like talking a big game after the fact about what a cowboy he'd been. But that in fact, as you can see clearly from the tape, this is a broken guy who was not at all trying to be a vigilante. Interestingly, the defense kind of had to say that Goetz was an unreliable narrator of what actually happened on that train. I mean, the story about him standing over Daryl Cabey and saying, "You don't look so bad, have another," I mean, that's extremely incriminating. And the way the defense handled that was by saying it didn't happen. He fantasized it. It was like he was in this fugue state where, he was imagining himself as, the guy from Death Wish or something. But yeah, like they wanted to show Goetz as an unreliable narrator who may have imagined himself as the aggressor in the situation, but in fact was like this meek and defenseless person who merely reacted to a threat and did so reasonably.
And so how does it work with the jury?
Well,
Goetz was found not guilty on the 4 counts of attempted murder and assault charges.
They did find him guilty on the weapons charges, but on the attempted murder charges, they acquitted him. And, from talking to the jurors and talking to the judge and talking to the prosecutor in the case and talking to the defense lawyers in the case, which we did for this show, what it really seems to have come down to is this idea of subjective reasonableness. And I know that sounds like jargon, and it kind of is, but basically the jury was asked to put themselves in Goetz's position, not only in the sense of like, what would you do if you were sitting in that seat and these 4 guys came up to you, but what would you do if you were him? And what would you do if you were him and had his specific past experiences? So, for example, the incident on the subway platform where he ended up running to the electronics shop, you as a juror had to imagine that had happened to you and weigh that in deciding whether Goetz's reaction to what happened on that subway car, whatever it was reasonable. It didn't matter, as it was explained to the jury, whether these young men were actually trying to hurt him, were actually trying to rob him. All that mattered is that Goetz thought they were. And if the jury concluded that his belief on that front was reasonable for him, then they had to acquit. And that's what they did.
And so did he spend any time in prison?
He did. On the weapons charge, he went to jail for under a year. And then he got out and went back to living in his apartment and, had a sort of strange, eccentric life in New York. Was often spotted feeding squirrels in the park. He loved and continues, I gather, to love taking care of squirrels. And he did face a civil trial in which he was found liable. The massive payout he was supposed to pay in damages to the Cabey family never materialized. He at one point he submitted his assets and included a $5 guinea pig, if I'm not mistaken.
Where is Goetz now? Is he still in New York City?
I don't know. I did not get to talk to him for the podcast. I did email with him, and I do include a quote from one of his emails to me, which I won't spoil here. It's one of my kind of favorite moments in the show because it, the whole time we were doing the reporting, we were like, well, we got to talk to this guy, right? We got to get him. And then we got this email from him, and it had this one line where we were like, oh, this is all we need, because it tells you everything.
Yeah.
But as to where he is, I don't know. He sent me some photos of himself, or rather, not of himself, of his squirrels. And it looked like he was in some kind of like leafy area. So I thought maybe he like moved for COVID, but I'm just speculating. I don't know where he is now.
And what about the boys, the 4 teens?
I mean, this was a pivotal event in all of their lives. 2 of them are no longer alive. One, Daryl Cabey, my understanding is he lives in an assisted living facility, and another, we interviewed, their family members. We didn't get to talk to either of them directly, but according to Troy Canty's brother, he's a mechanic somewhere in New York State. Keeps to himself. And would only agree to an interview with us if we could arrange for it to happen on live TV with him and Goetz facing off head to head. And I could not get that done. So,
the story happened in 1984, but it has so much resonance today still. What is it about this story that lingers for you?
Well, we were almost done with the show when Jordan Neely was killed. There had been an earlier subway shooting, like early in our production process. It seemed like a random shooting that took place on the train. That was, and when that happened, it was a data point in this growing sense that the city's subways system was becoming unsafe, and that had become unsafe during COVID, that it was being, taken over by vagrants and homeless people. And then as we were finishing the show, one of these people who lived on the subway, I gather, Jordan Neely, was, having some sort of episode. He had mental illness that he was struggling with, and one of his fellow passengers, Daniel Penny, felt that he was a threat, and he put him in a chokehold of some kind and basically choked him to death. And so I think one big reason this show came at the right time, journalistically, is that we're in a moment now where people are afraid again. The prevailing sentiment, certainly about the trains, and to a lesser extent New York overall, is that we're headed back to the bad old days, that it's going to be just like the 80s again. And the crime stats don't bear that out at all. But, the sense that we could have another Bernie Goetz, or that we in fact kind of did have another Bernie Goetz, maybe just underscores that as much as things change, they stay the same. I don't know, it's so trite, but I think it speaks to the sort of enduring power of fear. That's not to say it's totally crazy for people to be afraid on the subways, because as I said before, random things do happen. And if something is random, then it could happen at any second. I can understand that. But I think, we try to reckon in the show with what responsibility do we all have to keep our fear in check, and to balance our right to be afraid against other people's right to not bear the brunt of our reaction.
Your work is really vast, and you do seem drawn to interrogating major historical events, big ones like Watergate and Bill Clinton's impeachment. What draws you to these kind of stories?
I am just very aware that individuals' memories are short and imperfect, but then collective memory, insofar as such a thing exists, is really imperfect. The conventional wisdom about stuff that happened even 5-10 years ago is just often shockingly off base. And as soon as you go back and talk to the people who were there and try to reconstruct the cause and effect of how something turned out the way it did, you see that so little is preserved in the quote unquote collective memory. And often things get forgotten that kind of change how you look at what happened. With this story, I'll just mention that I said before about the sharpened screwdrivers that these young men had on them. That was a detail that every news organization ran with, and it made them sound like they were on the hunt, right? Jimmy Breslin, a columnist for the Daily News, basically did the reporting to confirm that, yes, they had screwdrivers, but they were not sharpened, and they were in their pockets, meaning that Goetz never saw them. They were not brandishing them. They were simply They were simply in their pockets, apparently because they were planning to use them to break into arcade game machines, which was like a common hustle at the time, like using screwdrivers to open arcade games and take all the change. And so that detail about the sharpened screwdrivers, you still see that in discussions of the case. Like that lie just never died. And so, we want people to see these stories that they kind of half remember or half understand with fresh eyes. And we do that by finding angles and corners of the stories that don't get like canonized in quite the same way as like the most famous moments,
Well, as a listener, I appreciate it. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me on and for talking about Fiasco, Vigilante. Can I say where people can find it?
Yes, it's on Audible, correct?
It's on Audible, yes. So if you have an Audible subscription, it's free to listen to. If you don't, you can go to audible.com and get a free trial and listen to it. And check out other seasons of Fiasco on other podcast players.
Great. Thanks, Leon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, as always, for listening to this week's episode of Crime Story. We're actually going to be taking a break for a few weeks for the summer, but we'll be back in September with a whole batch of new episodes. And ahead of that, we want to hear from you. Are there any guests that we should have on the show? Any topics you'd like to hear more of? We'd love your feedback. There's a link to a feedback survey in the episode description, or you can email us directly at crimestory@cbc.ca. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Sarah Clayton. Sound designed by Julian Uzielli. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard. And our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts. That's it for now. Have a great summer, and I'll see you in September.